Knowing AWS and how to build scalable cloud architectures is one of the key things companies are looking for when hiring new software developers. But if you've tried to learn AWS before, you'll know just how difficult it can be to get started and know what to even focus on. In this video, I'll show you the best approach to learn AWS and show you the resources that you need to know. The first step is getting familiar with the basics. You can't start building without knowing some of the key fundamentals to the cloud. This would include things like understanding the AWS global infrastructure, like regions and availability zones. You'll also want to be familiar with how permissions and access are managed with users and roles. And finally, have a general idea of some of the main services like S3, Lambda, DynamoDB, and EC2. I think the best way to start learning these things are with free resources available online. I recommend watching YouTube videos that prepare you for the AWS Solutions Architect Associate or Cloud Practitioner exam. These are certificates offered through AWS that cover the basics of working with their services. Now, I don't really recommend studying and taking the exam. I'm mainly recommending using the content from these videos as a good way to familiarize yourself with some of the basics. I'll link a few videos below along with some of the documentation that explains some of the core concepts. Now, you really want to be careful here. It can be tempting to just keep watching tutorials and never actually build anything. Anyone who knows AWS well will tell you the best way to actually learn it is by playing around and building with it. After you've spent a few hours learning some of the basics, I recommend moving on to the next step. Step 2 is creating an account. Signing up is pretty quick, but you will need a credit card. AWS operates on a pay-as-you-go model, so you only pay for the resources that you actually use. But there's a really good free tier that you shouldn't incur any expenses unless you're spinning up a ton of resources. Once you have your account created, steps 3 through 5 really just focus on working with services. Now, I'll go into what services to learn next, but I recommend following the pattern of working with a service in isolation, then building a simple architecture, and then going back and learning more complex features. When you're ready to start playing around in the console, it can be a little hard to know where to actually start. There's over 200 services, and not all are created equal. There are a few that you must learn, but for most of them, you'll only need them for certain applications, so you can learn them as you need them. You'll want to make sure you're prioritizing the right ones, so I'll break them down into 6 categories and the order to work through them. The first category is called Identity and Access. The only service I'm putting in this one is IAM. This service controls users and roles and permissions to resources in your account. This will be the first service you have to work with because you'll need to create a user once you sign into the console. IAM can be confusing, but it's well worth spending time here at first because every service relies on permissions. The second category I'm calling event-driven services. Some services I listed here are API Gateway, which let you create APIs, SNS and SQS, which are topic and queue services, and Lambda, which is a serverless compute service. I think this is a great place to start for a few reasons. These services are not only simpler to set up in comparison to, say, EC2, but they also heavily lean into the event-driven design pattern, which is pretty common in cloud architectures. The next category is called database and storage services. Here, I'm including DynamoDB, which is Amazon's NoSQL database, RDS, which is a relational database service, and S3, which is an object storage. After working with IAM, I recommend learning some of the services in these 2 categories. The services integrate really well with each other, so after working with them individually, you could build an architecture that looks like this. Here's a simple design that ties together a few of the services. I have an API gateway that when you send a post request to one of the endpoints, it'll invoke a Lambda function. This Lambda will write to a DynamoDB table and also create a file and put it in an S3 bucket. S3 will send a put object event to an SNS topic, which will go to 2 SQS queues. I have a Lambda function polling one of the queues, which will then receive the message and write it to a DynamoDB table. Like I mentioned before, you'll want to first work with each of these services individually before you start to put them together. As you start to integrate them, you'll reinforce the concepts around IAM as a lot of the services will need specific permissions. For example, the Lambda function will require that you create an IAM role that has permissions to read from the table and also pull the queue. The next category is EC2 and networking. Some of the big ones here are Route 53, which manages DNS, CloudFront, a content delivery network, EC2, a compute service, and VPCs, which manages networking in your account. This would be the next area to focus on as you learn AWS. Here's a design of an architecture that you could build with these services. In this design, I have a load balancer with hosts behind it. This is a common pattern for a backend API. I have EC2 instances inside a public subnet which each sit in a different availability zone. These EC2 instances are controlled by an auto-scaling group, which manage the host count based off of metrics such as CPU utilization. The load balancer sends incoming requests to the hosts and distributes the traffic between them. All of this sits inside a VPC, which is deployed to an AWS region. If you want, you could get a custom domain name with Route 53 and point that to the load balancer as well. The three categories I listed above are all in blue, and I'm grouping these together as kind of the core service architecture. If you were doing a system design interview, chances are most of the services that you would need would be referenced from one of these categories. The next category I called configuration and monitoring services. These services include CDK and CloudFormation, both infrastructure as code services. CloudWatch, which handles logs and metrics, and Cost Explorer, which enables you to view your bill and usage. Now, for these services, I don't really recommend waiting until after you've learned the core architecture ones above, but rather slowly working on them as you learn the others. Here's a way to think about it. I have a graph that shows that as you learn to build architectures, you also learn how to deploy, manage, and monitor those resources. A good way to do this is by looking at some of the metrics that are generated after using a service. So, for example, you could run a Lambda function and see the execution time and count in CloudWatch. You could also look at the logs that it outputs there too. And for some of the infrastructure as code services, you could try and model some of the designs I showed earlier with CDK and then deploy them with CloudFormation to your account. The final category, and the one I think that you should look at last, is what I'll call the enhancing services. This is where I'd put really the rest of the AWS services. I'd recommend learning these sort of as you need them. So for example, if you need to add authentication for users, I'd look into Cognito, or if you need to query objects in S3, you could use Athena, or SageMaker for machine learning applications. There's so many in this category that no one can be an expert in all of them, nor should you try to be. Okay, so that covers up the main services and the order in which I would learn them in. The next thing I want to talk about quickly is the ways that you can interact with these services. You have to remember that AWS is simply a collection of services, and those services are exposed through an API, where there are different operations that can be performed against it. For example, you could create a queue, delete a queue, list queues, send message, you get the idea. Now, there's three ways to interact with a service and perform these actions. The first is through the AWS console. This is the way that I recommend you learn it first. This is where you would go to the main AWS website and then sign into your account. Not only is this the easiest way to make changes, but it's also a great way to explore other features and settings that you can use. The next way is through the SDK. AWS publishes an SDK for all the main programming languages, and this is what allows you to programmatically interact with the services. For example, if your EC2 instance or Lambda function needs to read from a DynamoDB table or put an object in S3 or send a message to SQS, you could use the SDK in the programming language your code is written in to do it. The SDK makes it really easy to interact with the services in your code. Here's an example of the Java SDK being used to send a message to a queue. You simply use the SQS client and call the .sendMessage with a send message request, which contains the queue URL and the message body. I recommend sticking to just one programming language when you get started and then getting a feel for the SDK of it first. The last way to access AWS is through the AWS CLI. The CLI can be used to perform any action through the terminal, so you don't need to sign into the console every time. The CLI is great, and I recommend learning it, but I'd focus on the console and SDK first. Now that I've laid out everything that you should learn, I want to give you an overview of the documentation and show you what you should be referencing. So for each AWS service, there's going to be a developer guide and an API reference. So the developer guide covers an overview of the service, explains core concepts and how to use it. And then the API reference kind of gives you the specification for the API. So if you go over to the AWS homepage and then click on documentation, you can find the documentation section. From here, if you scroll down, under all products, you can search for a service. So I'll look for S3. If I open this up, I can see the user guide and the API reference. So I'll just open them up real quick. This is what the user guide looks like, and it goes into a ton of detail. It's a lot to read, but it's definitely something that you're going to want to work through every time you're learning a new service, and then referencing it again as you start to learn more. If you come over to the API reference, you're really not going to need this. It goes into details of if you were to write actions and make calls directly to their endpoint of how it would need to be set up, but you're mostly going to be using the SDK for this. Next are the SDKs. So there's a developer guide, which shows you how to set up and start using the SDK. And then there's an API reference, which gives a reference for every method that you can use. If I open up the documentation page again and scroll down to the bottom here, under SDKs and toolkits, you can see all the different programming languages. So I'll open up Java, and we can see we have the developer guide and the API reference. So the developer guide is going to show you, again, what you need to kind of get set up with it. And then if we go to the SDK, you can see that we have all the different services for whatever you might want to use. So I could open up S3, for example, and then open up one of the packages, and it'll show me how to create the clients and then start making calls to S3 programmatically. And last up is the AWS CLI. So again, there's going to be a user guide, which shows you how to actually set up the CLI, and then the command reference, which will have all the different commands and how to make calls. So if I go back to the documentation page and under products, if I search for CLI and open up the AWS CLI here, I can then get to the user guide and command reference. So I'll open up both of these. In the user guide, it's just going to explain sort of how to get it set up on your computer and install it. And then in the command reference, it'll give you a list of all the different commands for each of the services. And then inside each service, you can see the different actions that you can perform for what you might need to do. Learning AWS can definitely be a challenge at first, but as you start to progress through it, things will start to go much quicker. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe. Thanks.